Greetings, everyone, and welcome to the Tavern. I'm the Dapper Bard, here with the story of one of the most famous gods of them all, Thor, god of thunder, agriculture, and fertility. But before we get into the whole legend, there's a fun little factoid I just thought I'd share with everybody. Thursday is named after Thor. You see, in the original Roman calendar, Thursday was actually called Dia Jovis, or Jupiter's Day. And when the Germanic peoples adopted the Roman calendar, they changed some of the gods' names to gods within their pantheon. And one of those changes was to that day, which then became Thor's Day. And over time and the changes betwixt different languages, it became Thursday. Fun fact. Before I really get into Thor, I need to kind of describe something very important. Thor falls in the category that is referred to as aspirational heroes. An aspirational hero is a hero created in either myth or folklore or fiction whose sole purpose is to help people be better people, to live by example, to show proper moral behavior, making good ethical choices, defending the weak, and just generally being someone you can look up to and try to be like in your own life. While you may never have the powers of a god or a demigod or a superhero, you can at least look at these characters as a means by which to live your own life and make choices based on the kind of choices they would make. In the ancient world, there were plenty of these, including Hercules and Rama. As you moved in the Middle Ages, you got things like the Knights of the Round Table, and of course, Charlemagne's paladins. When you get into the modern age, you're looking at pulp heroes in some regards, and of course, superheroes like Superman and Captain America. And when you get into the current age, where a lot of the classic traditional aspirational heroes are being broke down, mocked, made into jokes. However, in Japan, there are still plenty of aspirational heroes, especially in manga and anime. This includes Deku from My Hero Academia, and of course, Tanjiro from Demon Slayer, amongst plenty of other classic heroes that we don't have time to list. The point is, Thor falls in this category and is one of the initial archetypes that helped lead to this becoming not only something within myth, but also something within fiction. The origins of Thor seem to date back to around the 1st century AD, where a bit of the Roman god Jupiter mixed with some of the Germanic local gods, and out of that derived eventually the Norse gods, and one of whom, of course, is Thor. Thor does have some of Jupiter's traits, which of course are derived from Zeus, and to a lesser extent derived from Marduk of the Babylonian myth. But that's getting a little too deep, so let's just go with the key traits here. He wields thunder, he is very important to the pantheon, and he is very, let's just say he's had a lot of girlfriends, so I can keep this video a little more PG. Due to this, Thor became the god of thunder, obviously. Agriculture, as thunder brings the rain, rain helps the farm, and the farmers praise Thor. And of course, fertility, because of how many women he had in his life. Thor himself was a tall man. He had very muscular build, long red hair, and a thick red beard. He was almost what you would call a traditional Viking. When you think of like the pictures of Vikings being these big, buff, red-headed, bearded dudes, Thor, right there. He had 3 special artifacts that gave him the ability to fight on par with giants, trolls, and ettins, amongst other threats to humanity. Of course, the most famous of these is Mjolnir the Hammer. In the myths, Mjolnir is a powerful warhammer forged by the dwarves and given to Thor by Loki as an apology gift for cutting off Thor's wife's hair. it's a long, complicated story that actually ties into a lot of the other gods in the pantheon. So for the time being, we'll skip that one, but I promise it will be an upcoming video. Anyhow, the hammer itself was supposed to be so heavy and so durable that it had enough strength to crush mountains, but also almost no one could lift it. Even Thor of his immense strength could struggle to hold it up for long periods of time. Thus, he had his two other artifacts that gave him the strength necessary. The first was a magical belt that doubled the strength that he had, giving him more than enough power to lift the hammer and wield it as if it was a standard, regular warhammer. The second was a set of gloves. The Yarngreeper. I just love the name. Sorry, I had to say it. Yarngreeper were gloves that allowed him to not only not harm his hands while wielding this powerful hammer through the feedback that would come from, of course, smacking something and having the shockwave go through the weapon itself, but also protected his hands when he would use his hammer to send bolts of lightning at his enemies. Except for iron is a conductive metal. He's a god. Just let it slide. Thor was born to Odin, the king of the gods, and a giantess. Depending on the legend and the story, the name of the giantess changes, and usually she has no other purpose other than being Thor's mother. So, not much I can really say about her. But yes, Thor is a half-giant who is best known for fighting other giants. It is probably also the source of his strength and his size. In addition to that, of course, he had many, many half-brothers, as Odin had many, many kids with different beings, both goddesses and giants. Thor himself had only one wife, the golden-haired goddess Sif, who represents faith, family, and fertility. In many ways, Sif represents the ideal wife and a mother in the Norse society, primarily because she is a protector of her family, her child, as Sif only had one child. But to anyone who would worship Sif would see that as the rule for I must protect my children. And of course, faith, meaning that as a mother, you're to teach your children a moral code, teach them the general beliefs of your culture, and of course, to share the stories of the gods with your children to make them grow up into proper Norse citizens. What makes the relationship very interesting is that it is a male god of fertility and a female god of fertility, which means the Norse were actually looking at the idea that you need both components to really have a child. And of course, both should represent how parents should behave, as I just said with Sif. And of course, Thor going out and fighting, protecting the village, hunting wild beasts, amongst other things that can be seen as aspirational traits that one could derive from Thor himself. However, Thor also had a lady on the side who was a giant named Jarnsaxa. And Jarnsaxa provided him with a son named Magni. In addition to that, he took many human lovers, usually after his great victories against the giants or the trolls. And amongst those, there was one known son named Modi. And of course, with Sif, he had his daughter, Thudr, who became a Valkyrie, which in and of itself is a whole other video, but they are the shield maidens of the Norse gods who help the armies of Earth and take the worthy up to the Valhalla. Many of Thor's stories involve him just traveling somewhere and fighting. There's not a lot of epic scope to his stories. More or less, he hears about trolls, ettins, giants, or other monsters threatening people in various villages, and he arrives there and smashes them in due course. Not a lot of heavy plots. If you were to think of Thor's stories, think of them more like a brain-dead action movie and less like an action thriller where we have a lot of twists and turns. Thor traveled on a chariot pulled by two magical goats that could fly. It is said that the sounds of thunder are the sounds of these goats and his chariot flying by at extreme speeds. Not only that, but he could slaughter his goats and eat them, and the next morning they would be completely revived to take him to his next destination, meaning Thor was never without food and never without transport. I wonder what magical goat meat tastes like. I can't imagine it's good. I don't know, it's magic goat meat though. Maybe it's delicious. Anyhow, because of these kinds of exploits, and of course people believing that when they hear a thunderstorm, it's Thor passing by, when they see lightning and it's Thor striking down on his enemies, you could see where the common folk might view him as a major hero. He was protecting them all the time, or at least whenever there was a major storm. Thus, people who were kind of more of the standard citizenry really began to worship Thor and feel that his protection was something they needed and that he himself was something to strive to become. You see, whether you were a farmer who would praise Thor for the rain on your crops, or you were a hunter going into the wilderness to fight beasts, and at that time you're talking about wild wolves, bears, amongst other animals of the Scandinavian region. Thor was never afraid of fighting monsters. You shouldn't be afraid of the beasts of the wild. And of course, going into war, battling against your enemies, and bringing great victory to your people, just like Thor did. Yeah. While, in contrast, scholars, nobles, and people on the more courtly and political side of things found themselves more drawn towards Odin and other gods who were less proactive, like Thor, and more thoughtful, planning things out, thinking things through. Even Odin tried to make some peace with the giants when he could, because Odin didn't want a giant war that would wipe out the giants and the gods. Which of course happened, that's called Ragnarok, and we will get to that. Due to Thor's proactive nature and aggressive stance towards his enemies, he and Odin didn't get along real well. They weren't feuding by any means, it's just in terms of favored child, Odin much preferred his children who were creative, who were thinkers, who were not immediately going to rush in and fight the monster the second it appears, versus Thor, who didn't make plans, wasn't particularly creative, and loved to just smash heads with his big hammer. Many of Thor's stories just involve him showing up at the last minute to slay some monsters. There are still some very interesting ones I could explore. However, for the sake of this video, I'm going to go through two very important ones. The first is a story where Thor was preparing a great feast at his lodge, which is said to be the largest of all the lodges built by the gods, with 450 rooms and made out of solid oak. It's pretty impressive. In order to have the party be the best party ever, he seeks a cauldron large enough to brew alcohol for all the gods in the court. So he finds a giant who has a cauldron that large and asks for the cauldron. And the giant says, "I will only give it to you if you can defeat me in a fishing contest. But if you can't, you have to give me something valuable of yours." Thor, of course, accepts, because he feels there's no contest he can't win. He's Thor, after all. So both he and the giant go out to the sea, and the giant is casting his line and catching a whale, and another whale, and another whale, and it looks like the giant's going to win. However, Thor sees something in the water that the giant would never try to catch. Jungmynir. Jungmynir is a giant serpent. It is one of Loki's children, and in this story, it was still young and not that large, maybe say the size of an island, versus at the time of Ragnarok, Jungmynir not only circles the earth, but in many tellings circles it multiple times in terms of how large this sea serpent becomes. Well, Thor, not fearing the serpent or its poison, fishes and catches Jungmynir, tosses him on the boat and says, "That's larger than all your whales. I win." The giant pushes Jungmynir back into the ocean and says, "That isn't something you can eat, and therefore I have won because you can eat whales." Well, the argument goes on, and Thor and the giant end up having to fight each other, where of course Thor wins. Giant smashing hammer. He then takes the cauldron and the whales back to his lodge. The whales are prepared as meat, and the cauldron brews the delicious booze for all the gods. And he throws a god tier rager. Because that's the kind of stories you get out of Thor. As I said, these aren't epic adventures, more or less encounters in his life that end up with Thor having to get in a fight and then having a big party afterwards. And honestly, it's kind of awesome. However, Thor is one of the few heroes who is not just aspirational in his deeds, but even in his death, he still inspired people. At the Great Battle of Ragnarok, which we will get to in a future video, as I foreshadowed earlier, Thor was tasked with taking down Jormungandr. They had had multiple encounters in the past, and Thor was ready for this fight. But the battle lasted for days, if not weeks. As they struggled, this giant serpent, whose body could encircle the world one or possibly more times, depending on who is telling the story. I prefer the more than one times. It just makes the threat seem that much more unbeatable. But Thor was ready, and he fought, and he fought, and he fought. And in the end, Jormungandr fell. But Thor was beaten. He was bruised. He was cut. His body was flooded with the poison of the giant serpent. And looking at his fallen foe, he turned and saw that the battle was still raging on, and he was needed to help the gods win the war. So he marched forward to fight. Unfortunately, after 9 steps, he succumbed to his wounds and the poison. And holding his hammer in his hand, he fell and died, but never let go of Mjolnir. When the battle was over, and the earth was reborn, out of all the ashes, Thor's 2 sons, Magni and Moti, survived. And they found their father's body, and they found his hammer. And though they could not wield the hammer themselves, together they were able to pull the hammer to a place where it could be set and revered and used as a symbol of order, a symbol of peace, and a symbol of strength, to show people that their father's sacrifice was one of the reasons why humanity could continue to live on. And centuries later, the stories are still told, and Thor is still viewed as one of the greatest heroes. Even in death, he is an inspiration to everyone who hears his stories. Before we wrap up, there's something that I'd just like to say. If you had a hero, an aspirational hero, who helped you get through the tough times in your life, no one can take that away. No matter what they do, no matter the terrible stories, no matter how they try to portray your hero as a joke or as a loser, it doesn't matter, because it's your hero. And if your hero kept you going, whatever some other person wants to do to destroy that hero will never truly destroy the hero. After all, villains try to destroy heroes. Many of us keep them in our hearts and use them as inspirations to become better people. I hope this has inspired you, and I hope this gives you a renewed love of your favorite aspirational hero. If you've been with the channel for a long time, thank you. I'm sorry about the hiatus. Between health issues and my computer breaking, well, it took longer than I thought to get back on my feet and going with this channel. But I promise you we'll be catching up on the Zodiac and getting a lot more videos like this, and possibly even just some story time videos where I tell a legend of one of the great heroes I talk about. If you're new to the channel, please like and subscribe. Share this video with your friends. Thor is a pretty awesome dude, and he has some great stories. If there's enough popularity for this video, I promise I'll tell more Thor stories, even though they'll basically have the same ending of Thor smashing someone's skull in. But hey, you know what? Sometimes you just want an action movie where the hero kicks all the butt. If you can, please drop a line in the comments telling me about your favorite aspirational hero, or about some hero you want me to cover in a future video. I am paying attention to the comments, and I will get to them. I promise. Until next time, thank you for watching. And remember, heroes never die, and I'll see you at the tavern.